at once, but across 8 weeks that September through November, 3 plantation masters along the Mississippi River between Natchez and Vicksburg awoke to find their right hands had betrayed them. Edmund Payne felt it first, a numbness that spread from fingertips to wrist, then exploded into cramping so violent his wife heard him from 2 rooms away. Joseph Beaumont's hand withered over days, the muscles atrophying as if something invisible was eating him from the inside out. Lucien Arsenault's skin erupted in blistering sores that wept clear fluid and never stopped, the pain so constant he couldn't sleep without laudanum. Physicians came. They prescribed mercury treatments, bloodletting, bed rest. They whispered about contaminated well water, about vapors from the swamps, about God's mysterious judgments. But none of them could explain why the affliction struck only the right hand. None could explain why 3 wealthy men, miles apart, suffered identical fates within weeks of each other. There was one connection nobody wanted to say out loud. In the days before each man's hand failed, an enslaved midwife named Rue had been called to their properties. She delivered babies, mixed tisanes, offered her services with downcast eyes and steady hands. Then she left, and then the screaming started. By December, as frost killed the last of the cane grass and South Carolina voted to leave the Union, Rue was gone. Just gone. Her name disappeared from Bellefontaine's ledgers. Her cabin was reassigned. The plantation books were amended to show she died of fever that winter, common enough that nobody questioned it. 3 masters, 3 ruined hands, 1 woman erased from every official record. But here's what those men didn't know. Rue kept her own records, and in her ledger, debts were never forgiven. September 1860. The air along the Mississippi hung thick and wet, the kind of heat that made shirts stick to skin before noon. At Bellefontaine Plantation, 8 miles south of Natchez, Rue knelt in her cabin as evening light slanted through the gaps in the wood planks. She was 25 years old, small-boned, with hands that moved with the precision of someone who'd spent a lifetime learning to read bodies. Women across 3 parishes asked for her by name when their time came. White mistresses and enslaved mothers alike, they all wanted Rue's hands guiding their children into the world. What they didn't know was that every birth, every death, every whispered secret told in the agony of labor, Rue remembered it all. She pried up the loose floorboard beneath her cot. Wrapped in oilcloth, hidden in the crawlspace, was a journal bound in leather. The pages were filled with writing so small it looked like insect tracks. A cipher of her own invention, mixing English letters with symbols that meant nothing to anyone but her. It wasn't a diary, it was an accounting. Names of mothers whose children were sold before they stopped nursing, names of men who visited the quarters after dark, names of masters who paid for tisanes that ended inconvenient pregnancies. 25 years of truth that would never appear in any courthouse record. She opened to a blank page and wrote a new entry in her careful cipher. Delphine, age 16, pregnant, arrived from Thornhill Plantation. She closed the journal, returned it to its hiding place. Her fingers traced over the jars on her table: monkshood, jimson weed, nightshade, poison sumac. Plants her mother had taught her to use for healing, plants that could also be used for other purposes. She spoke to the empty cabin, her voice barely above a whisper. Some debts must be settled. Rue learned about death before she understood her own name. She was born in the spring of 1835, delivered by her mother's own hands in a cabin that smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs. Abina had come to Bellefontaine 5 years earlier, brought from the Georgia coast where the Gullah people kept knowledge the white world didn't understand. Root work, herb craft, the old ways of reading sickness in a person's eyes, of knowing which plants held healing and which held sleep without dreams. By the time Rue could walk, Abina was the most sought-after midwife in the parish. White women called for her when their labors went wrong. Enslaved women came to her cabin after dark, whispering requests they couldn't speak in daylight. Abina understood both languages, the public one of bringing healthy babies into masters' families, and the private one of ending pregnancies that would only bring more suffering into the world. Rue was 8 years old the first time she watched her mother mix a teasing for a girl barely older than herself. The girl didn't speak, didn't need to. Abina's hands moved with quiet certainty, measuring pennyroyal and tansy into hot water, whispering instructions the girl would follow alone in the darkness of her own cabin. "Why does she need it?" Rue asked after the girl left. Abina looked at her daughter for a long moment. "Because mercy takes different forms. Sometimes bringing life into this world is cruelty. Understanding the difference, that's what separates healers from butchers." The lessons came slowly, deliberately. Which bark stopped bleeding, which leaves brought on labor when a baby was stuck and time was running out, which roots caused fever, which caused sleep, which caused the body to empty itself of what it carried. By age 12, Rue could identify 40 medicinal plants by touch alone, eyes closed, fingers reading the texture of leaves and stems. By 15, she understood that every plant that healed could also harm. It was only a question of dose, of preparation, of intent. Abina never wrote anything down where others could find it, but she taught Rue to create her own system, her own language. "What we know threatens them," she said one evening, grinding dried roots into powder. "So we keep it hidden. We make it look like luck or accident or God's will. But we remember. Always we remember." The most important lesson came on a winter night when Rue was 14. They sat by firelight, Abina's hands sorting through dried flowers. "Our hands bring life into this world. Remember, child, hands that bring life can also take it away, but only when the debt demands payment." Rue didn't fully understand then. She wouldn't until years later when she'd seen enough stolen children and broken mothers to fill her own ledger with unpaid debts. Abina died in the winter of 1858. Pneumonia took her in 3 days, her lungs filling with fluid no herb could drain. She was 46 years old. Rue was 23, and suddenly she was the one women called for in the night. Lucien Arsenault, master of Bellefontaine, barely acknowledged the transition. To him, Abina had been a valuable tool. Now Rue was that tool. He was a third-generation planter, educated in New Orleans, fluent in the language of cotton futures and slave depreciation. He calculated the worth of human beings the way other men calculated livestock, by productivity, by breeding potential, by market value. Rue learned to become invisible in his presence. Eyes down, voice soft, face revealing nothing while her mind catalogued everything. After Abina's burial, a quick affair in the quarters cemetery, Rue returned to the cabin they'd shared. She found her mother's journal hidden in a place even she hadn't known existed, sewn into the mattress ticking. The pages were filled with Abina's cipher, different from the one she'd taught Rue, but close enough to decode. It wasn't healing recipes. It was 20 years of crimes written in careful detail. Names, dates, acts that would never appear in any courthouse record. Rue sat on the cabin floor, reading by candlelight, understanding for the first time that her mother hadn't just been teaching her to heal. She'd been teaching her to keep accounts. The new girl arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, when the heat still clung to everything like a second skin. Delphine came in a wagon driven by Thornhill Plantation's overseer, a man who handed Lucien Arsenault the bill of sale and left without saying more than necessary. The girl climbed down slowly, one hand braced against her lower back, the other clutching a cloth bundle that held whatever she'd been allowed to keep. She was 16, 6 months pregnant, belly round and obvious beneath her worn dress. Her face had the kind of emptiness that comes from learning to feel nothing, because feeling anything at all might break you completely. The quarters women saw her and knew. They didn't need explanations. They'd seen it before. Girls purchased quickly, moved to different plantations, the timing always convenient for someone's reputation. They greeted Delphine with quiet nods, showed her to an empty cabin, brought her water and cornbread without asking questions. Rue watched from her doorway, studied the way Delphine moved, like someone trying to take up as little space as possible, the way her eyes stayed fixed on the ground, not from respect, but from practice. 2 nights later, after the overseer blew the conch horn for curfew and the quarters fell into careful silence, Rue heard footsteps outside her cabin, a soft knock, barely audible. Delphine stood in the doorway, backlit by moonlight. "Can I come in?" Rue stepped aside, closed the door, gestured to the wooden stool by her work table, where dried herbs hung from the rafters and clay jars lined the shelves. Delphine sat. She didn't cry, didn't tremble. She spoke in a voice scraped clean of emotion, like she was reciting something she'd rehearsed until it stopped hurting. "Master Payne, Edmund Payne, at Thornhill. He started coming to my cabin when I was 14. My mama died the year before, so I was alone. He said I was special, that he'd take care of me, that I should be grateful he chose me instead of the field gangs." Rue's hands continued sorting tansy leaves, but her movements became mechanical. It was twice a week at first, then more. His wife knew, she had to know, but she never said anything, not until I started showing. Then suddenly it was a problem, a scandal waiting to happen. She wanted me gone immediately. Delphine's voice dropped lower. "He came to see me the night before they sold me, told me this was temporary, that once the baby was born and dealt with, he'd buy me back, that I was his favorite, and he always took care of his favorites." Rue's hands went completely still. Her jaw tightened, a muscle jumping near her ear. Her eyes fixed on something beyond the cabin walls, seeing things Delphine couldn't name. "When is the baby due?" Rue asked. Her voice was quiet, but there was something in it, something cold and deliberate. "January." Rue nodded once. She stood, walked Delphine to the door, squeezed her shoulder briefly, the only comfort she could offer in a world that had none to spare. After Delphine left, Rue bolted the door, retrieved her journal from beneath the floorboards, opened to a fresh page. By candlelight, her hand moved across the paper in careful cipher. She wrote Edmund Payne's name. Underneath it, details, Delphine's age when it started, the pregnancy, the promise to buy her back, the phrase, his favorite, that made Rue's stomach turn. At the bottom of the entry, she added one word in letters slightly larger than the rest. First. She closed the journal. The candle flickered, casting shadows that danced across the cabin walls like ghosts waiting for their turn to speak. Outside, September's heat was finally breaking. Soon the harvest would come, then winter, and before winter arrived, Edmund Payne would learn that some debts compound interest. Rue found Lucien Arsenault on the main house gallery the next morning, reviewing cotton receipts with his factor. She waited at the bottom of the stairs, eyes down, until he noticed her. "What is it?" "Master, I received word from Thornhill Plantation, a woman in labor, breech position. They're asking if I might come help. The local midwife won't attempt it." Lucien barely glanced up from his papers. "Thornhill, that's Payne's place?" "Yes, sir." He waved a hand dismissively. "Fine. Be back by tomorrow evening. Celeste may need you soon." That was it. No questions about why they'd specifically requested her. No concern about the 12-mile journey. To him, she was a tool being borrowed by a neighboring planter, nothing more complicated than lending out a plow horse. Rue had counted on that. In 300 births across 7 plantations, she'd built a reputation for skill and discretion. Masters trusted her because she'd never given them reason not to. She was valuable property who increased her own worth with every successful delivery. That trust was about to cost Edmund Payne dearly. Back in her cabin, Rue laid out her supplies with the precision of someone performing surgery. From the rafters, she selected dried monkshood roots, her mother's voice echoing in memory. Small doses mimic paralysis, child. The body betrays itself. Jimson weed seeds went into a separate pouch, poisoned sumac oil carefully extracted and stored in a dark glass vial. Nature provides weapons for those patient enough to learn them, Abina had taught her. The trick is making it look like God's judgment instead of human hands. Rue's movements were methodical, emotionless. This wasn't rage. Rage was messy, visible, the kind of thing that got you killed. This was calculation, justice delivered by the only court that would hear cases like Delphine's. "You're going to Thornhill." Rue turned. Josephine stood in the doorway, 70 years old, bent from decades in the laundry, but her eyes sharp as ever. She looked at the herbs on the table, at Rue's careful preparations, and understood everything without needing words. "Yes." Josephine nodded slowly. "Your mama would say be careful. I'll say be smart." She left without waiting for a response. Alone again, Rue allowed herself one moment of doubt. If she was caught, it wouldn't just be her life. The quarters would suffer. Collective punishment was how masters maintained control. Hurt one, terrorize all. Through the window, she saw Delphine sitting outside her cabin, one hand resting on her swollen belly. The girl's hand shook, a constant tremor she probably didn't even notice anymore. Rue packed her midwife's bag. Legitimate medicines on top, willow bark, dried raspberry leaf, clean cloths. The poison tinctures hidden beneath, wrapped in oilcloth, indistinguishable from a dozen other preparations. She slung the bag over her shoulder and walked toward the road that would take her 12 miles upriver to Thornhill. Edmund Payne was expecting a midwife. He had no idea what was actually coming. Thornhill Plantation sprawled along the Mississippi's eastern bank, smaller than Bellefontaine but prosperous enough to announce itself with a brick main house and white columns that caught the afternoon light. The quarters sat in tidy rows behind the sugar processing sheds, where the air hung thick and sweet with molasses smell that made Rue's throat close. Edmund Payne met her at the main house steps. He was 53 years old, florid-faced and barrel-chested, wearing clothes that cost more than most people earned in a year. He moved with the easy confidence of a man who'd spent his entire life getting exactly what he wanted it. "You're the midwife from Bellefontaine? Took you long enough." "Yes, sir. I came as quick as I could." "Well, get on with it then. Marion's been laboring since dawn. If she can't produce a healthy child, I've wasted good money on her." Rue followed him to the quarters, where a woman named Miriam lay on a corn-shuck mattress, her body rigid with pain. She was in her 30s, exhausted, the baby positioned wrong, feet first instead of head down. This was the work Rue actually knew, the work that required skill, patience, hands that could read a body's internal map without seeing it. She knelt beside Miriam, felt the woman's belly, located the baby's position. "I can turn it," Rue said quietly, "but it's going to hurt worse before it gets better." Miriam just nodded, too tired for words. For the next 3 hours Rue worked. She gave Miriam raspberry leaf tea to help with contractions, used her hands to carefully reposition the baby through the abdominal wall, a technique her mother had taught her that most midwives didn't know. The baby turned. The labor progressed. By evening, Miriam delivered a healthy son who screamed loud enough to wake the dead. Payne appeared in the doorway as Rue cleaned the infant. His face split into a satisfied grin. "Well done. Here." He tossed her a silver dollar that landed on the bed. "That's for your skill." Rue picked up the coin, eyes downcast. "Thank you, sir. You're very generous." "You need anything before you head back?" "If I might rest a few hours, sir? The walk back in darkness isn't safe for a woman alone." Payne waved dismissively. "Stay in the kitchen quarters. Leave at first light." He left, already forgetting she existed. Rue waited, helped Miriam settle with her newborn, accepted a meal of cornbread and buttermilk from the kitchen. lay down on a pallet in the quarters and pretended to sleep while listening to the plantation settle into night. At midnight, she rose. The main house was dark, except for a single lamp burning in Payne's study. He always worked late, the quarters women had told her. She moved through shadows she'd memorized during the afternoon, avoiding the squeaking boards, keeping to the edges of hallways. The study door was unlocked. Inside, ledgers lined the shelves, records of purchases, sales, breeding schedules for humans documented like livestock. On the sideboard sat a crystal decanter of brandy, half empty, Payne's nightly indulgence before bed. Rue pulled the prepared vial from her bag. Monkshood and Jimson weed, measured precisely. Not enough to kill. That would bring physicians, investigations, attention. Just enough to cause permanent damage that would look like natural affliction. She mixed it into the brandy, swirled the decanter gently to distribute it, replaced the stopper. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing stayed steady. She thought about Delphine's voice saying, his favorite. Thought about how many other girls had heard those same words in the darkness of their cabins, powerless to refuse. Rue left the study exactly as she'd found it, returned to the quarters, waited for dawn. She departed Thornhill as the sun broke over the river, her midwife's bag lighter now by one vial. The quarters women watched her go from their doorways, silent witnesses who understood everything and would remember nothing if questioned. By noon, Edmund Payne lifted his brandy glass for his midday drink. The liquid went down smooth. Within an hour, the cramping started. Within 3 hours, he was screaming. His right hand seized into a claw, the muscles spasming so violently his wife had to hold him down while servants ran for the physician. The numbness that followed was worse than the pain. His hand went dead, useless, a piece of meat attached to his wrist that wouldn't obey his commands. 3 days later, back at Bellefontaine, Rue opened her ledger to Edmund Payne's entry. Beside his name, she added one word in her careful cipher: settled. News traveled slowly along the Mississippi, but it traveled. Enslaved boatmen carried it between landings, their conversations quiet as they loaded cotton and sugar. Washerwomen met at the river's edge where plantation boundaries blurred, exchanging information while their hands worked. Traders moving between estates brought whispers with their goods, careful words that white folks never quite heard, but everyone else understood perfectly. Edmund Payne's affliction became the talk of 3 parishes within 2 weeks. His hand had seized into a permanent claw, the fingers purled inward like a dead spider. Physicians came from Natchez, from Vicksburg, even one from New Orleans. They bled him, dosed him with mercury, prescribed rest and prayer. None of it helped. The hand stayed ruined, the pain constant enough that Payne couldn't sleep without laudanum. In the quarters across multiple plantations, reactions were mixed. Some people were frightened. Mysterious illness felt too much like hoodoo, like curses that might spread. Others felt a quiet satisfaction they'd never voice aloud. But everyone wore the same carefully neutral expression when white people were around. Payne's wife called for a priest. She told her friends in hushed parlor conversations that her husband was being punished for sins she wouldn't name. The priest came, blessed the house, left holy water and prayers that accomplished nothing. At Bellefontaine, life continued with its own tensions. Celeste Arsenault was 7 months pregnant now, her belly swollen and heavy, her face drawn with worry. The last pregnancy had nearly killed her, hemorrhaging that wouldn't stop, fever that lasted for days. She'd survived only because of Rue's skill and something close to mercy. Rue attended her twice a week now, mixed tisanes for nausea and swelling, checked the baby's position with gentle hands, spoke in reassuring tones while cataloging everything she'd need when the time came. Lucian's anxiety filled the house like smoke. He needed an heir. His entire empire, The cotton, the sugar, the careful web of credit and reputation, all of it depended on producing a son to inherit. He hovered near his wife, snapping at servants, drinking more than usual. On a Tuesday afternoon, Joseph Beaumont arrived for a social call. He was a thin, nervous man in his late 40s, master of a plantation 15 miles downriver. He and Lucian sat on the gallery, discussing cotton prices and politics, Lincoln's name spoken like a curse, talk of secession growing louder every day. Rue served the mint juleps, moving like a shadow, present but unnoticed. "Terrible thing about Edmund Payne," Beaumont said, swirling his drink. "Saw him at church last Sunday. His hand looks like something died on the end of his arm. Physicians can't explain it. They suspect poisoning but can't identify the source. Tested his well water, his food, everything. Nothing. It's peculiar." Rue refilled their glasses, her face blank as stone. That evening, Josephine found her sorting herbs in the cabin. The old woman closed the door, stood with her arms crossed. "People are talking about pain, about timing. People always talk. Rue," Josephine's voice dropped. "Patterns draw attention. You being careful?" Rue's hands kept moving, separating dried roots into different piles. "There are 2 more debts to settle, then I'll be gone." The old woman studied her for a long moment. "How long you been planning this?" "Long enough." The old woman nodded slowly, asked nothing else, and left. 3 days later, a messenger arrived at Bellefontaine. The Beaumont estate was requesting Rue's services, a difficult birth, breech position, local midwives refusing to attempt it. Rue read the message twice, looked at her ledger where Joseph Beaumont's name had been written for 6 months, waiting. "Tell them I'll come tomorrow," she said. The boat ride downriver took most of the morning, November cold settling over the Mississippi like a held breath. Rue sat in the stern with her midwife's bag, watching the water slide past brown and slow, feeling the season change around her. Beaumont Plantation announced itself from a distance, sprawling fields that should have been prosperous but looked worn down, neglected. The main house needed paint, fences sagged. The quarters showed signs of an overseer who ruled through brutality because the master was too weak to command respect any other way. Joseph Beaumont met her at the house, his thin face pinched with worry. He was 48 but looked older, shoulders permanently hunched like he was waiting for the next disaster to strike. "About time. The girl's been laboring since midnight." Claudette was 19, exhausted beyond words, the baby lodged sideways in a position that would kill them both if it didn't change. Rue worked for hours, hands reading flesh and bone, repositioning inch by careful inch, using technique most midwives didn't know existed. But some things even skill can't fix. The baby came feet first near evening, silent and blue, the cord wrapped twice around its neck, already gone before it ever had a chance to breathe. Claudette's tears fell without sound. Rue cleaned the tiny body with gentle hands, wrapped it in cloth, felt genuine sorrow settle in her chest. Not all deaths were deserved. Some were just the cruel mathematics of bodies and bad luck. Beaumont appeared in the doorway, looked at the stillborn child, shrugged. "Well, that's unfortunate, but at least there's no complications." He turned to Claudette, who was still bleeding, still crying silently. "You're young. You can try again in a few months. I need productive workers, not ones who can't even birth properly." He left. Didn't ask if Claudette was all right. Didn't acknowledge the death as anything more than failed production. Rue stayed with Claudette until the bleeding slowed, until the girl fell into exhausted sleep. Then she went to collect her payment from Beaumont's study. The room smelled of tobacco and anxiety. Ledgers lined the shelves, documenting a plantation sliding slowly into debt. On a side table sat Beaumont's private medicine cabinet, laudanum bottles he kept for the nerves that never let him rest. Rue had studied her mother's ledger for months before Abina died, had memorized the entries about Joseph Beaumont, 3 infants born in his quarters over 5 years, 3 babies whose skin came out too pale to ignore. 3 times Beaumont had ordered them handled, suffocated in the first hours of life, deaths recorded as natural causes. 3 murders he'd never answer for in any court that white men recognized. Rue pulled the vial from her bag. Nightshade extract this time, different from what she'd used on pain. This one worked slower, mimicked the progressive palsies that sometimes struck men in middle age. She measured carefully into Beaumont's laudanum, knowing he'd take his evening dose within hours. She left the next morning with $2 silver and the thanks of Beaumont's wife, who'd noticed nothing wrong. 3 days later, Joseph Beaumont woke to find his right hand trembling. By afternoon, the tremors had spread up his arm. By evening, his hand hung useless at his side, the muscles visibly atrophying. Physicians came, called it a palsy, couldn't explain the cause or offer any treatment that worked. Beaumont's wife told her prayer circle it was divine judgment. She didn't specify for what, but the women nodded like they understood. Word spread faster this time. 2 plantation masters, 2 ruined right hands, 2 visits from the same midwife just days before the afflictions began. Still not proof, still not quite enough to voice suspicions aloud, but the pattern was forming, visible now to anyone paying attention. At Bellefontaine, Rue added 1 word to Beaumont's ledger entry. Settled. 2 debts paid, 1 remaining. Celeste's labor started on a cold November evening, 3 weeks before anyone expected it. Her water broke during supper, and within an hour the whole house was in controlled chaos. Servants running for hot water, Lucien barking orders, Celeste gripping the bedpost with white-knuckled hands. Rue arrived to find the birthing room already prepared. Fine linen sheets, instruments she'd cleaned and stored weeks ago, everything arranged exactly as she'd specified, because Lucien Arsenault left nothing to chance when his future heir was at stake. He paced the hallway outside, boots wearing a path in the carpet. Everything he'd built, 3,000 acres, 200 enslaved people, credit with banks in New Orleans, all of it meant nothing without a son to inherit. Inside the room, Celeste was terrified. Rue could see it in her eyes, in the way her breath came too fast. The last pregnancy had nearly killed her. Hemorrhaging that wouldn't stop, fever that lasted 5 days. She'd survived only because Rue had knowledge most midwives didn't possess. "I don't want to die," Celeste whispered. "You won't," Rue said, and meant it. The birth was difficult, but not catastrophic. Another breech position. Rue was starting to think Celeste's body just made babies that way. She worked for hours, hands reading the contractions, repositioning when the moment was right, using every technique Abina had taught her. A daughter came just after midnight, healthy, screaming loud enough to wake the dead, perfect in every way except the one that mattered to Lucien. He stood in the doorway when Rue called him in. His face showed disappointment for just a moment before he covered it with forced celebration. A daughter, not the heir he'd wanted, but a child nonetheless. "Let me hold her," he said. Rue had prepared for this moment. The towel she handed him, soft, white, carefully folded, had been soaking in poisoned sumac oil for hours, then dried just enough to avoid suspicion. The toxin would absorb through skin, slow but certain. Lucien took his daughter in those prepared linens, cradling her against his chest, his hands wrapped in fabric that was destroying him cell by cell. His face softened looking at her. For a moment he almost looked human. Rue watched, feeling something twist in her chest. This was a father holding his newborn child, a moment of genuine love in a man who'd built his empire on stolen lives. But then she remembered. The children he'd sold away from screaming mothers. The families destroyed because it was more profitable to sell them separately. The girls in the quarters who'd learned to go silent when the overseer came at night because Lucia never asked questions he didn't want answers to. "Excellent work, Rue," he said, handing the baby back. "You'll have extra rations this week. You've earned them." Treating her like a well-performing dog, like her skill was something he owned along with everything else. Within a week, Lucien's right hand erupted in blistering sores. The skin wept clear fluid that never stopped, the pain so constant he couldn't sleep without morphine. Within 2 weeks, he couldn't hold a pen, couldn't sign ledgers, couldn't manage the plantation that required his signature on a dozen documents daily. His empire began slipping through fingers that no longer worked. 3 masters, 3 ruined hands, 1 midwife present before each affliction began. The pattern was impossible to ignore now. December brought frost to the canebrakes and secession talk to every parlor in the parish. South Carolina was preparing to leave the Union, and men gathered in groups to argue about states' rights and northern aggression, while their wives planned Christmas parties as if the world wasn't about to crack open. But there was another conversation happening, quieter and more uncomfortable. 3 plantation masters, 3 ruined right hands, 3 mysterious afflictions that physicians couldn't explain. At church gatherings, women whispered behind fans. At market days, men discussed it over tobacco and cotton prices. At social calls, the topic came up carefully, obliquely, like probing a wound to see how deep it went. Someone, no one could remember who, mentioned the midwife, the one from Bellefontaine. She'd been present at all 3 estates just days before the afflictions began. But that was absurd, wasn't it? Rue had attended hundreds of births across 7 plantations over the years. Her reputation was spotless. The idea that an enslaved woman could deliberately harm 3 masters and escape detection for months? It was impossible. Except it wasn't impossible. It had happened, and that realization carried a fear deeper than any physical injury. If she could do this, what did that say about their control, about the system they'd built their entire world on? Lucien Arsenault sat in his study, his ruined hand wrapped in bandages that needed changing twice daily, and calculated. His pride was wounded. His ability to manage his plantation was compromised, but pursuing an investigation meant admitting vulnerability. It meant asking questions that might have uncomfortable answers. He sent discreet messages to Edmund Payne and Joseph Beaumont. They met through intermediaries. None of the 3 men could write anymore, and traveling was difficult with useless hands. The meeting happened at Lucien's study, behind closed doors, with only the most trusted overseers present. "We all know the timing," Payne said, his voice tight with pain and anger. "That midwife was at each of our properties right before this happened. But if we accuse her," Beaumont added nervously, "people will ask why. Why would she target us specifically?" That was the problem. That was the shared dilemma they couldn't speak aloud. Each man had secrets. Payne's quarters produced multiple pregnancies from girls who got sold away immediately after giving birth. Beaumont's reputation for handling complications, infants who died mysteriously, was known but never discussed. Lucien's entire operation depended on an overseer whose brutality kept people terrified, and on selling children away from mothers when it was financially convenient. An investigation would invite scrutiny, questions they couldn't afford to answer. "We call the parish constable," Lucien finally said, "but we keep it quiet, discreet. We can't let this spread or we'll have panic in every quarter from here to Baton Rouge." The others agreed because they had no better option. Meanwhile, in Bellefontaine's quarters, the tension was suffocating. People moved carefully, spoke quietly, felt the storm building but couldn't name it. Rue continued her work with absolute calm. She attended a birth in the South Fields, delivered a healthy boy, accepted payment with downcast eyes, mixed medicines for Celeste's recovery, checked on Delphine, now 8 months pregnant, and gave her herbs for the final stretch. Her face revealed nothing, but in her cabin at night she gathered supplies, studied the crude map of swamp routes someone had drawn for her years ago, considered how far north she'd need to travel to find safety. Josephine watched from a distance, knowing everything, saying nothing. The ledger stayed hidden in her laundry trunk, wrapped in clean sheets, waiting. On December 10th, a house servant whose name no one ever discovered overheard Lucien summoning the parish constable. The message traveled through the invisible network, kitchen to quarters to fields, moving faster than any white person could track. 4 hours before the constable was scheduled to arrive, someone knocked softly on Rue's cabin door. "They're coming for you." Rue stood in the center of her cabin, holding her mother's ledger and her own. 25 years of documented truth in her hands. Names, dates, crimes. The shadow history of 7 plantations written in cipher no one else could read. She could burn it, hide it, take it with her into whatever came next. The choice felt impossibly heavy and absolutely clear at the same time. Rue had 4 hours. She moved through her cabin with methodical precision, no wasted motion, no panic. Some things she burned in the fireplace, papers with practice cipher, notes on plant preparations that were too specific. Other things she buried in the hard December ground behind her cabin, her mother's mortar and pestle, clay jars she couldn't carry, tools that had been Abina's. The ledgers, both her mother's and her own, she wrapped carefully in oilcloth. Josephine came as the sun reached its peak, stood in the doorway, face impassive, eyes understanding everything. "You need to take these." Rue handed her the wrapped bundle. "Hide them. If I don't come back, you decide. Burn them, bury them, pass them on, but remember what's written." Josephine took the bundle, surprisingly heavy for its size. "Where are you going?" "Better you don't know. Protects us both." The old woman nodded. They'd lived long enough to understand that survival sometimes meant strategic ignorance. She touched Rue's cheek once, briefly, then left without another word. The quarters moved with quiet purpose after that. A woman Rue had helped through 3 difficult births appeared with extra cornbread wrapped in cloth. A man whose wife Rue had saved from childbed fever brought a heavier shawl, wool instead of cotton. Someone else, Rue never saw who, left information scratched in the dirt outside her cabin. Safe paths through the canebrake, which overseer would be working the north fields, how to avoid the dogs if they came. Delphine was the last person Rue saw. The girl stood outside her cabin, one hand on her swollen belly, face struggling not to cry. Rue gave her a pouch of herbs, red raspberry leaf for the final month, shepherd's purse if the bleeding won't stop after. "You remember what I taught you?" Delphine nodded, then, voice breaking, "You settled debts that weren't even yours." "They were everyone's debts. I just kept better records." They embraced once, quickly, and Rue left before either of them could say anything else. Mid-afternoon she walked out of the quarters, moved through sugar fields stripped bare by harvest, the stubble crunching under her feet, into the canebrake where grass grew higher than her head, thick enough to swallow her completely, toward the swamp where water and mud would hide any trail, where the world became a maze only certain people knew how to navigate. She didn't look back. At Bellefontaine, the parish constable arrived just before sunset. A formality, really. Lucien had already calculated that Rue would be gone. The questioning was perfunctory. Had anyone seen the midwife? Did anyone know where she might go? The quarters presented unified ignorance. No one saw anything, heard anything, knew anything. Their faces were blank as winter sky. The constable asked about dogs, about organizing a search. Lucien declined. Sending riders and hounds across multiple parishes would draw exactly the attention he wanted to avoid. Questions about why they were hunting this particular woman, speculation about what she might have done. Better to let her vanish. He sent messages to Payne and Beaumont that evening. They agreed. The official story would be simple. Rue had died of fever, common enough in December. No one would question it. Within days, her name was struck from plantation ledgers. Her cabin was reassigned to a family who'd been doubled up in the quarters. Her remaining possessions, the few things she hadn't burned or buried, were collected and burned anyway. The books were amended, birth records altered, any mention of her carefully erased. By Christmas, when families gathered for celebrations and South Carolina officially left the Union, Bellefontaine's records showed no evidence that a midwife named Rue had ever existed. But 3 plantation masters lived with hands that didn't work. 3 men who woke every morning to pain that wouldn't stop, to weakness that reminded them daily of something they couldn't name and wouldn't discuss. Rue walked into winter, into swamp and canebrake, into a landscape that would keep her secrets. Where she went, no one knows. How she survived, no record shows. She simply vanished, like smoke on December wind. And 3 men lived with the consequences for the rest of their lives. Josephine kept the ledgers hidden for 3 years, wrapped in oilcloth, buried beneath winter quilts in her laundry trunk while the world tore itself apart. 1861, secession became war. Men marched off in gray uniforms, convinced they'd be home by Christmas. They weren't. 1862, battles with names that would become history. Shiloh, Antietam, places where thousands died in single days. The plantation economy strained under blockades and conscription. 1863, Lincoln's proclamation changed everything on paper. Freedom declared by a president whose authority the South didn't recognize, but the words mattered anyway. Union gunboats shelled Vicksburg, the sound carrying across the river parishes like approaching thunder. Through it all, Lucien Arsenault declined. His hand never healed. The sores finally closed but left scar tissue so thick he couldn't bend his fingers. He couldn't sign documents, couldn't manage ledgers, couldn't maintain the tight control his plantation required. His rage grew as his empire slipped away, dollar by dollar, acre by acre. Edmund Payne suffered a stroke in 1867, dying bitter and confused, his useless hand clutched against his chest. His wife wore black at the funeral and looked quietly relieved. Josephine Beaumont lost his plantation to debt in 1868, spent his final years drinking cheap whiskey, his withered hand shaking so badly he could barely hold the bottle. Dead by 1870, alone in a boarding house in Natchez. 3 masters destroyed, not by war, but by injuries no one could explain. In 1863, when Union forces occupied the region and Bellefontaine became a refugee camp for formerly enslaved people, Josephine made her decision. She gave the ledgers to Solomon Chase, a freedmen's bureau teacher who'd come from Philadelphia to establish schools. Solomon was 32, educated at Oberlin College, carrying the careful optimism of a man who believed documentation could create justice. He understood immediately what Josephine handed him. "This is testimony," he said, turning the pages carefully, "but I can't read it." The woman who wrote it made her own language, said it was safer that way. Solomon spent weeks decoding the cipher. It was brilliant, mixing English letters with French words, symbols that borrowed from West African languages Rue must have learned from her mother. Complex enough that casual inspection revealed nothing, but systematic enough that patient study could break it. What he found made him sit in silence for a long time. 25 years of crimes documented with clinical precision. Names of mothers and stolen children, dates of forced pregnancies, records of infants killed because their skin revealed inconvenient truths. The shadow history of 7 plantations, written in a hand so steady it could have been recording weather observations. The entries about Payne, Beaumont, and Arsenault stopped him cold. Their names, their specific crimes, the dates of Rue's visits, and beside each name, in letters slightly larger, debt settled. "This is evidence," he whispered to the empty room. "This is proof of everything they'll never admit happened." He brought the ledger to a Harper's Weekly journalist in 1866. A brief article was published, sensational, incomplete, focusing on the mysterious afflictions rather than the documented atrocities. The story disappeared quickly in the chaos of Reconstruction. No one wanted to think about slavery anymore. Everyone wanted to move forward, forget, rebuild. But Solomon kept the ledger, passed it to historians, to archivists, to people who understood its value. Eventually, it was donated to a university collection where it remains today. Physical evidence that Rue existed, preserved precisely because she documented everything others tried to erase. Her voice speaking across decades, refusing silence. The story started during the war and never really stopped. Whispered accounts of a midwife who moved through Delta parishes like wind through cane grass, appearing when women needed her most, delivering babies that other midwives had given up on, then vanishing before dawn. No name given, no payment requested, just steady hands and knowledge that seemed older than memory. Some said she made it north on the Underground Railroad, hidden in wagons carrying contraband across state lines, eventually reaching freedom in Canada or maybe Philadelphia. Others claimed she disappeared into the Atchafalaya swamp, living among the maroon communities that had existed there for generations, people who'd chosen drowning over chains and somehow survived. Nobody knew for certain. Everyone had a theory. In the 1930s, when the WPA sent interviewers to record the memories of formerly enslaved people, Rue's name came up in fragments. Old people in their 80s and 90s, remembering stories their parents told, tales that might have been true or might have been wishes shaped into words. A woman named Octavia, 89 years old, interviewed in a cabin outside Natchez in 1936. My mama said there was a healer who went by many names. Nobody knew her real one. She'd come when the birth was going bad, when the mama was dying and the baby was stuck. She'd save them both, give instructions for aftercare, then be gone by morning. Mama said she was settling old debts, said she moved like a ghost, but worked like someone who'd never forgotten a single thing done to her or anyone she loved. No photographs exist, no confirmed sightings after December 1860, just stories that accumulated like sediment, layer upon layer until it became impossible to separate truth from legend. In black communities, Rue became a folk hero, proof that resistance didn't always look like rebellion, that justice could be claimed through knowledge and patience, that the system's power had limits, that some debts eventually came due. In white communities, she became a ghost story, a cautionary tale about the danger of letting enslaved people learn too much, move too freely, accumulate knowledge that could be weaponized. The fear wasn't just what she'd done, it was what her existence implied, that the control they'd built everything on was always more fragile than it seemed. Modern historians argue about her. Some claim she's a composite figure, multiple women's stories condensed into one mythical midwife. Others point to the ledger, to documented evidence that matches her recorded movements, to newspaper accounts of 3 plantation masters suffering identical mysterious injuries in autumn 1860. The medical records exist. The births she attended are documented in plantation ledgers that survived. The 3 men's afflictions appear in physicians' notes and death certificates. But Rue herself, after December 1860, nothing. She became the story that couldn't be erased, even when her name was struck from every official record. Her fate unknown, her impact undeniable. A woman who kept her own accounts and settled her own debts, then disappeared into history like smoke. The ledger sits today in climate-controlled archives at a southern university, housed in acid-free boxes, available to researchers by appointment only. You have to wear gloves to touch it, sign forms, agree not to use flash photography. The pages are yellowed but intact, the ink faded to brown but still legible. Rue's handwriting is small, precise, the letters formed with the care of someone who understood that words could survive longer than the person who wrote them. The cipher has been decoded now, annotated, published in academic journals. What was once secret language is now open testimony, available to anyone willing to read it. Modern scholars have spent years cross-referencing Rue's entries with other historical documents, plantation records, census data, newspaper accounts, court filings, cemetery registries, medical journals from the 1860s. The discoveries keep coming. Birth dates in Rue's ledger matched amended plantation records, children officially listed as born months later than they actually were, the timing adjusted to hide inconvenient mathematics about conception. Deaths she documented appear in cemetery records, but with different causes listed. Babies she recorded as suffocated by order appear in official books as natural causes or failure to thrive. The three masters' fates are completely verified. Medical records describe their mysterious hand afflictions in detail. Physicians noting the progressive nature, the resistance to all treatments, the identical presentation despite the men having no contact with each other. Newspaper articles track their declining fortunes. Death certificates confirm how they died and when. But what makes the ledger historically significant isn't just the verification of facts. It's that this is one of the few first-hand accounts from an enslaved woman documenting the system from inside its machinery. Rue's voice is preserved in brief annotations that carry devastating weight. Child born, sold at 3 months to trader heading to New Orleans, mother inconsolable for weeks. Delivered stillborn twins, father was the overseer, mother 14 years old, no one asked questions. Called to master's wife for Tesson to remedy an indiscretion, ended pregnancy 5 months along, disposed of remains myself. Clinical, precise, unbearable in their matter-of-fact horror. But the ledger documents more than suffering. It documents resistance. Herbs administered that prevented conception, given quietly to women who couldn't bear bringing more children into bondage. Tessons that ended forced pregnancies. Plants that caused mysterious illnesses in overseers known for brutality. Fevers that mimicked malaria. Stomach ailments that lasted weeks. Afflictions that looked natural but weren't accidents. Modern medical analysis reveals how sophisticated Rue's knowledge was. Botanists confirm her plant identifications are accurate, her understanding of dosages and interactions remarkably precise. Physicians note that her methods were calibrated carefully, enough to cause effect, not enough to kill, always leaving room for plausible deniability. The revelation that changes everything. Rue wasn't just a midwife. She was running an underground network, protecting enslaved women through medicine and knowledge, using healing as cover for a more complex operation. But here's where it gets ethically complicated for modern audiences. Rue deliberately harmed 3 men, caused permanent injuries. Those weren't accidents. They weren't mistakes. They were calculated acts of retribution that left 3 human beings in chronic pain for the rest of their lives. How do we reckon with that? The counter-perspective comes fast. Those 3 men enslaved hundreds of people, destroyed families for profit, caused immeasurable suffering with complete legal protection. Edmund Payne repeatedly assaulted a girl beginning at age 14. Joseph Beaumont ordered infants suffocated. Lucien Arsenault built his wealth by selling children away from mothers. They faced no consequences in any court of law, because the law protected them, because the law defined the people they harmed as property, not humans. A philosopher writing about the ledger in 2019 put it this way: Rue operated outside a legal system that denied her humanity and provided no mechanism for justice. She created her own court, applied her own sentences, used the only tools available to her: knowledge, patience, and the chemistry of plants that grow in swamps. The broader context matters. Resistance during slavery took countless forms, most of which were deliberately erased from historical records. The ledger proves what scholars have long argued. Enslaved people weren't passive victims. They fought back constantly, using whatever weapons they could access: work slowdowns, tool breaking, arson, escape, and yes, targeted violence against those who brutalized them. Rue's methods were invisible, deniable, designed to look like natural affliction rather than human action. That was survival. That was strategic. After December 12, 1860, there's no record of Rue, no grave, no confirmed sightings, just legends that may or may not contain truth. But her ledger remains, physical proof that she existed, that she documented, that she acted. The final entry, written the morning she disappeared, is a single line in her cipher: "The debts are settled. The record remains. They cannot erase us all." She was right. 3 masters lived with ruined hands for the rest of their lives, constant physical reminders that power has limits, that some debts eventually come due, that the people they thought they controlled were watching, remembering, waiting. Rue vanished, but her words survived. She was erased from official records but preserved her own testimony. She lost her freedom, but never her agency. She became the ghost they couldn't exorcise and the truth they couldn't bury. Her story matters because it reveals what was hidden, the women who fought back in ways that left no obvious traces, the resistance that looked like compliance, the justice claimed when law provided none. The ledger speaks across 160 years, refusing silence, demanding recognition. Rue kept her own accounts, and in the end, the accounts are all that matter. If stories like these matter to you because they deserve to be remembered, join us, subscribe to the channel, share, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next one.